Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling a topic that's got everyone buzzing, end times prophecies. And let me tell you, you guys sent in a ton of material for this one.
It seems everyone's got end times on their mind these days.
They really do. We're talking religious articles, sermons, even a satirical take from the Babylon Bee, Jonathan Cahn, Rondi Mallet, Focus on the Family, even two sermons from Jerry Durman.
Quite the lineup.
Seriously, it's like everyone's got an opinion on whether the Daily News is, a sign of the apocalypse or just, well, Tuesday. So, our mission today is to help you cut through the noise and find those nuggets of insight. And who better to help us than our expert?
Well, I wouldn't say I have all the answers, but I'm definitely fascinated by how people are interpreting these ancient ideas in our modern world.
Me too. And speaking of interpreting things in a, shall we say, creative way, the Babylon Bee really went there with their 7 undeniable signs we are living in the end times. Remember that one?
How could I forget?
I mean, Trump's presidency as the 7th trumpet of Revelation, they had me laughing out loud.
Their satirical take on prophecy definitely struck a chord.
It seems like no matter what era, people view current events through the lens of the apocalypse, especially during times of uncertainty.
It's a human tendency that's been around for centuries.
For sure. Like, we're always looking for signs, even if they're hidden in a Ghostbusters remake, another one of the Bee's undeniable signs. But jokes aside, this whole end times thing, it's not just a modern-day obsession, is it?
Not at all. It's a theme woven into the history of countless cultures and religions. It's fascinating, really, to see how those anxieties about the future, political turmoil, natural disasters, moral decline, they've echoed across generations.
It's like those themes are almost universal. So
Yeah.
if these anxieties are so universal and we've seen similar events throughout history, wars, famines, persecution, all that, why even bother looking for signs?
That's a great question. And it gets to the heart of how we interpret the events happening around us. It's not about ignoring what's going on in the world, but more about how we're framing it.
So are we viewing every earthquake or conflict as this sign from above, or could we be looking at them through a different lens?
Exactly. It's about perspective. Take earthquakes, for example. We have a scientific understanding of plate tectonics, seismic activity.
Yeah.
But for someone with deep faith, that same earthquake, it might hold a profound spiritual meaning.
Even if it's not a literal sign of the apocalypse.
Exactly. It's about holding both objective and subjective truths together.
Which seems to be a big part of the focus on the family's message, right? That we should be focused on living out our faith in the present moment rather than getting caught up in timelines and dates.
Absolutely. It's about living a life of purpose and meaning today.
Which brings us to Jonathan Cahn and this idea of a Josiah moment things like corrupt king stumbles upon God's lost law, total change of heart, leads a revival. Cahn seems to be drawing a parallel to today, like maybe we're in a similar moment of decline, but also have that potential for a turnaround.
It is an intriguing idea. Whether or not you see those parallels to our current world, the idea of revival, that even when things seem their bleakest, there's always hope for renewal and positive change. It's a powerful message.
It really is. But then we have Jerry Durman, who takes a much more literal approach to biblical prophecy. His sermons really dive into the nitty-gritty, especially when it comes to, like, the mark of the beast.
It's certainly a topic that captures the imagination. This idea of a mark that could control your ability to buy or sell. It sounds like something out of a dystopian novel, but Durman argues that we're seeing the early stages of it in our time.
Right. And he gets into specifics too, digital currencies, cashless societies, those microchip implants. It's definitely enough to make you double check your credit card statement.
It does make you think twice about surveillance and control in this digital age. But it's important to remember that these are just one perspective on these prophecies.
Okay, so take it all with a grain of salt. Don't go trading your smartphone for a flock of chickens just yet.
Precise.
Speaking of taking things with a grain of salt, we also have Rondi Mallet's article from Prophecy Newswatch. He seems to think many end times prophecies are already happening. How common is that belief?
It's a belief held by a significant portion of certain Christian denominations. They see things like wars, natural disasters, social and technological shifts as evidence that we're living in the last days.
So are they like checking off boxes on a prophecy checklist like time is running out?
In a way, yes. But it's important to remember that even within that belief system, there are many different interpretations.
Of course.
What one person might see as a major prophetic sign, someone else could see as, well, just another Tuesday.
Right. So much to think about, and we haven't even scratched the surface of the rapture or Armageddon yet. You've definitely given us a lot to digest already. Any major takeaways before we dive into the even juicier stuff?
I think the biggest takeaway, at least so far, is that while these prophecies can be absolutely fascinating, it's crucial to remember that they're all open to interpretation.
Don't let the future overshadow living a meaningful life in the present.
Exact.
Sound advice. And on that note, we'll be right back to delve even deeper into the mysteries of the end times. Don't go anywhere. And we are back, diving headfirst back into the world of end times prophecies. Before we jumped into the break, we were talking about interpreting these prophecies, and there's one concept that seems to really get people fired up: the rapture. Jerry Durman, he spends a good chunk of his sermons on it, and honestly, it's a lot to wrap your head around.
It's a topic that definitely sparks a lot of debate, even among those who agree on the basic premise.
Right, like, is it a giant group HUD in the sky or what?
Well, the imagery we see in Scripture often describes believers being like caught up to meet the Lord in the air.
Yeah.
But the real heart of the debate is when this event takes place in relation to this other major event, the tribulation.
Okay, so for those of us who haven't cracked open Revelation in a while, remind us, what exactly is the tribulation?
Think, basically, a period of really intense turmoil and suffering on Earth. We're talking wars, natural disasters, basically all around bad news.
Sounds rough.
It's a pretty bleak picture, and that's really where this whole rapture debate comes into play.
Because if there's a way to skip out on that, who wouldn't, right?
Exactly. And that's the view of the pre-tribulationists, like Durman. They believe the rapture happens before any of the tribulation, which spares believers from that whole messy business.
So it's like a cosmic rain check on all the apocalypse stuff.
You could put it that way. They see it as God protecting his followers from the worst parts of what's to come. But just like everything else in this field, there's always other interpretations.
Right, like maybe you don't get to completely skip out on the tribulation.
Right. Mid-tribulationists, they believe the rapture occurs somewhere in the middle of that 7-year period, maybe right before the most intense stuff goes down.
So you might catch a break, but maybe not the entire season pass.
A good way to put it. And then there are the post-tribulationists. They believe the rapture happens at the very end, right before Jesus returns to establish his kingdom.
So it's like the last-minute rescue as the credits are rolling.
You could say that. Each of these views really hinges on how these different groups interpret specific verses in Scripture.
Yeah.
We're mostly talking Thessalonians, Daniel, and Revelation.
And Durman is firmly in the pre-tribulation camp, right? He rattles off a whole bunch of verses to support it.
He does. And he really emphasizes God's desire to protect believers from the wrath to come, which he really sees as those 7 bowls of judgment described in Revelation.
Right, he kept saying that God doesn't appoint us to wrath, so we have to get out of here before things get really, really bad.
That's the main point of his argument, for sure. But again, it's super important to remember that these are very complex theological issues. Even within Christianity, there's a whole range of valid interpretations.
So no need to book that one-way ticket to heaven just yet.
Not just yet. Let's keep exploring these ideas with an open mind.
Speaking of exploring, we can't forget Durman's deep dive into the mark of the beast either. Those real-world examples he brought up, those were pretty freaky.
Yeah, that passage in Revelation about not being able to buy or sell without the mark, it really captures people's imaginations.
It does.
And it connects it directly to all those things we've already talked about.
Yeah.
The rise of digital currencies, cashless societies, even microchips that are being implanted in some cases.
Yeah, and he even showed a news story about this company that's letting people pay for things just by waving their hand over something.
It does feel like we're moving closer and closer to a sci-fi world.
It really does. So what do we do? Should we be, digging ditches and stocking up on canned goods or what?
I think it's less about prepping for some literal mark and more about staying aware of how all these systems could erode our freedoms and autonomy in the long run.
So be mindful, but maybe not paranoid.
That's a good way to put it.
But let's shift gears a bit and talk about the tribulation itself. Durman really doesn't sugarcoat it.
No, not at all. He goes into a lot of detail about the 7 seals, trumpets, and bowls of judgment that are described in Revelation. He really paints a very vivid picture of that 7-year period.
Yeah, earthquakes, plagues, scorching heat. It's like Mother Nature is having a complete meltdown.
And Durman emphasizes that it's all a result of humanity rejecting God, like a manifestation of us descending into sin.
So, time out for humanity. Is that basically it?
Yeah, in a sense. But we have to remember that even within Christian theology, Judgment isn't just about punishment. It can also be about purification, about setting the stage for something new and really better.
Right, there's always that glimmer of hope, even when it comes to these prophecies.
Exactly. However horrific the tribulation is, it's not the end. It's just the thing that happens before Christ returns and establishes his kingdom. It's a time of peace and justice and righteousness.
Okay, so even with all the doom and gloom, there's a light at the end of the tunnel. But I gotta admit, some of the judgments he describes, like the hailstones that weigh 100 pounds each, that's some scary stuff.
It definitely captures the imagination.
Sure.
But again, remember, these descriptions, they're often symbolic. They're not meant to be taken literally, but rather to convey just how serious God's judgment is and what can happen when we turn away from him.
Makes you think twice, right?
Perhaps. But if we're being serious, the point that Dermot is making is that even when faced with unimaginable suffering, even in the face of these judgments, people will still refuse to repent and turn to God.
It's like a cautionary tale about how stubborn we can be.
Exactly. Our choices have consequences, both in this life and in the next.
Lots to ponder there. But before we get completely lost in the weeds of the apocalypse, we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back to talk about the mother of all showdowns, Armageddon. Don't go anywhere.
And we're back for the final act of our End Times deep dive. We've
Oh.
talked about prophecies, judgments, even scored a cosmic rain check with the rapture. But now it's time to face the ultimate showdown, Armageddon.
Definitely a topic that tends to get people's imaginations going. Yeah, no kidding. And speaking of imaginations, let's talk about the elephant, or maybe that's the beast, in the room, the infamous number, 666. Derman, he really geeks out on this one.
It's a number with a lot of weight behind it.
He connects it to the mark of the beast, and this idea that the whole system is basically going rogue.
Well, in Revelation, it's very clearly linked to the beast, who most interpret as the Antichrist, basically someone who represents the opposite of God's plan.
So it's not just some random horror movie thing.
Not at all. There's a ton of theological and historical significance there. Some scholars even interpret it as a deliberate contrast to the number 7, which, in the Bible represents completeness and perfection.
So like 666 is the evil twin of 7.
You could say that.
Yeah.
It represents falling short of God's ideal. A world that promises everything, but in the end leads to destruction, separation from God.
And that's where Derman starts to connect the dots to our modern world, right? Digital currencies, microchips, this whole push for a cashless society. It almost feels like he's saying it's all straight out of Revelation.
He does raise some interesting points about how our reliance on technology could be used to control us, to manipulate us, even if it's not a literal fulfillment of the mark of the beast prophecy.
It's like that saying, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. But seriously, how do we know, where's the line between being healthily skeptical and, full-blown tinfoil hat territory?
I think the key is to stay informed and to stay engaged. We should be asking these hard questions about how these technologies are being developed and how they're being implemented, but without jumping to these apocalyptic conclusions.
So awareness over alarm.
I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay, so maybe hold off on building that bunker for now, but we can't wrap up this conversation without talking about the big one. Armageddon. Derman really lays out quite the picture. Global war, clashing armies, the whole 9 yards. Is that how most people see it playing out?
It's definitely a popular interpretation, especially among those who take a more literal approach to Revelation. The idea of this final massive battle between good and evil, ending with the return of Christ, it's definitely a powerful image.
And Derman even names the place, right? The Valley of Megiddo in Israel.
Right.
That place is steeped in history, isn't it? Like a battleground for thousands of years.
It is. Megiddo has seen countless conflicts, which is why some believe that it has a symbolic significance when it comes to the end times.
So it's like the ultimate battleground.
Right, the place where history comes full circle. But it's also important to remember that not every interpretation of Armageddon is literal.
Oh, interesting.
Some people see it more symbolically as this representation of the constant struggle between good and evil, a battle that plays out in a cosmic sense, but also, within each of us.
So it's less about actual tanks and missiles, more about the choices that we make, the battles that we fight inside ourselves.
Exactly. It's recognizing that that fight for, I guess you could call it the soul of humanity, it's always happening on a global scale and also in our own hearts.
That's actually a really profound way to think about it. But let's be real, whether it's literal or symbolic, the end times is a pretty heavy topic. Derman ends his sermons with this call to action. He's asking people to, get right with God and to be prepared. What does that even look like in a practical sense?
I think at its core, it's about living your life in a way that reflects your values. It's seeking forgiveness where you need to and reconciling where you need to. And I think cultivating a relationship with something that's bigger than yourself, whether that's through your faith or through your community or just, by connecting with the world around you.
So less about stockpiling supplies and more about, I don't know, building bridges.
Yeah, exactly. It's about finding that meaning and purpose in this moment, right now, instead of getting lost in all the what ifs of the future.
Wow, we really took a deep dive today. We went to the edge of the apocalypse and back. Do you have any final words of wisdom for our listeners as we resurface?
I'd say embrace the mystery of it all. These ancient texts offer so much to explore and to reflect on. So engage with them, ask those tough questions, and don't be afraid to come to your own conclusions.
Love it. Great advice to end on. And on that note, it's time to wrap up our deep dive into the end times. A huge thank you to our expert for guiding us through this. It's been fascinating.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep exploring, keep asking those questions, and remember, even if the world is ending, there's always time for another deep dive. Until next time.